I wish I could. I could. Why, I oughta. His face, which at this moment was a mixture of Don Quixote, the devil, and Dean Swift, I don't know who Dean Swift is, broke into a certain deep wrinkles, evidence of another laughing fit, which contorted it considerably, while he controlled and prevented the outburst. Paul Trent now looked at his watch. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "I have decided that I want you two, after all, to come out with me to Markmoor Court tonight. I only pray we shan't find Will Zoyland closeted with his father. I'm afraid if Will got on our track at this juncture, he'd ruin the whole thing. What a blessing he's out at Wookie." As soon as the visitors were gone, Cordelia said hurriedly to her husband, "Better take your stroll now, hadn't you, while I do the things?" "What did you say?" murmured Mr. Evans, giving the back of the purple chair a push to move it towards the fire. "Better go out and do your evening stroll over while I wash up," repeated Cordelia. Mr. Evans stared blankly at her. The natural movements of any couple, in their own house, when a group of visitors have departed, is to draw up to the hearth with an ebullition of relief and begin a critical analysis of the evening. This was clearly what Mr. Evans expected, and he was a little nonplussed. He had not much to say to Cordelia about communes and commune makers, but he had a great deal to say to her about the harrying of Anmon. The girl had already left him, however, and crossing the little passage into the kitchen, so he snatched up his long black overcoat with its peg and let himself out without a word. From its peg, not with its peg. "She's cross," he said to himself, "because I laughed like that. She thinks I made a fool of myself." Sounds like he did. He followed the old Wells Road till he reached a turn to his left called Edmund Hill Lane, which led to the clay pits and the tile works of Edmund Hill pottery. This pottery had played an important part in the modern life of Glastonbury, supplying the town council with those fine large brick tiles of a beautiful orange-red color with which it had roofed all its new workmen's houses, not only in Old Wells Road and Bovetown, but also in Benedict Street. It was from under these bright red tiles, made of rich Somersetshire clay, that the hopes and despairs of many generations of Glastonbury people were destined to mount up, and follow in its gusts, night by night, this dream-burdened westerly wind. Mr. Evans now got glimpses of a tormented half-moon in the sky, as he walked along, tossed, tumbled, rolled, buffeted by piled-up cloud racks, driven themselves across the rain-swept spaces by the same wind. Edmund Hill Lane was at this hour a lonely place to walk in, as it stretched upward towards those isolated clay pits. Its ruts were clay, its banks were clay, it had been cut out of clay, and it led to the richest clay pit in the West Country. And all this clay, which in time would be molded and hardened into roofs for the dreams of Glastonbury people, dreams that would be, so Mr. Evans told himself now as he strode along, such the same whether under Dave Spear's commune or Philip Crow's capitalism, called out to Mr. Evans and tugged softly at him, with wet, mute, rainy, dumbly murmuring mouths, and straining coldly, heavy, corpse-like fingers. The glimpses he got of that wildly tossed half-moon stirred the imagination of this man in the tight-waisted black coat and bowler hat. The wet clay struck more and more clingingly to his boots as he advanced up the windy hill, leaving Glastonbury and his conspirators far behind them, and his mind followed those weird old Chthonian deities of his race, whose dim personalities, veiled under these Cymric syllables, Piwil, Pideri, Lulwich, Limiwak, called to him out of the wet earth. The very dreams of the people behind him, mounted up alongside of him from under the tiled roofs of the town, fell away from him now, and sunk down like a flutter of autumn leaves. That iron bar in the brain of Finn Taller, of which he had heard without hearing, sank down. The great lorries full of hermetic tin, diabolus metallium, of which Philip, in his house in the New Wells Road, was thinking, fell away and sank down. The herring of Anwen. How much more there was of the essential sorrow of things, and of the essential exaltation of things in that queer phrase, than in all this absurd business of buying legal parchments for the Marquis of P. Or from the Marquis of P. I'm kind of flubbing my words today. Sorry about that. As he walked along under the sickly moon and the feverish clouds, Mr. Evans thought to himself how much more real the world of consciousness was than the world of matter. At any given spot on the earth's surface, he thought, the consciousness of men are flowing and floating just below the blind material surface. They have the same sun, the same moon, the same stars. But it is with the souls of these things, with their under essences, that the consciousness of men have dealings. He came to a heap of clumsily thatched turnips by a wayside barn that the owner had covered up for winter feed from his cattle. And upon this heap he sat down, pressing the tails of his black coat under his thin flanks against the damp of this dark mound. And sitting there alone under this turbulent sky, it came over him that the lives of men upon earth were all subject to the captivity of Gwer in Care City, lured by the emissary of Pilwell and Piddery. In other words, that they were all held in bond by something alien, by something external to their true, free essence. But he got the feeling that his own deeper nature could take hold of his body, yes, and take hold of all this bodily world around him, and drive them both, as this world was driving these clouds, as this wind was driving these clouds, upon strange occult purposes of its own. Mr. Evans rested upon this thought for a second, holding himself aloof with an austere effort and grasping fate itself, as a man grasps the handle of a plough. But even while he was experiencing this masterful sensation, there slid into his erotic nerve the quivering forked tongue of his unpardonable sin. Something about what he had seen this afternoon in the sheepfold had broken a barrier in the fortress of his sensual concentration. And through this hole there now slid, or threatened to slide, the electric tingling body of the undying worm. I must make use, he said to himself, of what Gerd is doing with that grail spring. The pageant didn't kill it, but perhaps this water, these crowds, this white magic of old Gerd may kill it. So he spoke, but as if in mockery of old Gerd, and all he could do, there moved, there stirred, there awoke, in the remote circles of being beyond this wild sky, the appalling perilous stuff of the double-natured first cause, capital F, capital C, and its primordial evil, capital E, as with its wavering searchlight it fathomed the numberless worlds of its living victims. The first cause struck straight down now at the responsive nerves of Mr. Evans's vice, and as it stirred that poison it gave itself up to an orgasm of egocentric contemplation. As for Mr. Evans, he saw himself returning to his house with his madness, and with this horror upon him. He saw himself mounting the narrow stairs. He saw himself embracing Cordelia. And he felt he could not do it. He felt he could not go home just then, with his reptile lifting up its head. complete with the captivity, he muttered to himself, of Gwere and Skyer City. Without realizing what he was doing, he pressed his left hand under the wet thatch of the turnip heap and pulled out a turnip. This, all muddy as it was, he pressed to his face, smelling at it with his hooked nose, and finally biting it with his strong wolfish front teeth. While the Welshman sat on the damp heap of turnips and bit, with ferocious and yet hardly conscious impulse, into the flesh of one of the rankest and most astringent turnips in the heap, spitting out with mouthful after he had chewed it, and once more plunging his teeth into the sharp-smelling substance, it happened that a microscopic creature, all mouths and yet all belly, was enjoying or suffering from precisely the same twinge of egocentric mania as were Mr. Evans and the First Cause, as it lay coiled up upon the surface of this very same vegetable. Thus it was fated for this particular turnip heap in Edmund Hill Lane, halfway between Allswell's Road and the brick-tiled works, to be the occasion of the bringing together, at exactly 3 minutes to 9 o'clock on the night of the 12th of December, of three identical psychic aberrations, that of the infinitesimal microscopic parasite, that of Mr. Owen Evans, and that of the ultimate First Cause. Human beings are, however, more sensitive to interruptions from chance than any gods or insects, and it was Mr. Evans who was the first to be distracted from this obsession of vicious contemplation. He became aware of the approach of voices coming down Edmund Hill Lane from the direction of the brick works. They were the voices of a man and a boy, and they were amusing themselves by hooting like screech owls. Apparently, some real nocturnal bird of the species they were imitating was following them in the darkness, for Mr. Evans could hear at intervals a cry that was like an echo of the noises that these pedestrians were making, following them at no considerable distance. He got up hurriedly from his damp seat and threw the turnip away. In its fall, the insect feeding upon its surface was brushed off, which meant the death of that very night of that microscopic parasite. The First Cause alone continued its unspeakable contemplation, that motion of evil in the ultimate abyss, against which all the good that is in mankind is forever struggling. Mr. Evans advanced up the lane to meet the newcomers. This he did because he had the peculiarity of always having a nervous dread of people overtaking him in the dark, and yet he felt reluctant to hurry off home. He found himself even now possessed of a morbid fear of their stumbling upon him unwarned. So, although with something of an effort, he forced himself to cry out, "Hello there," in an almost menacing voice. "Good evening, Mr. Evans," came the reply out of the darkness, and he found himself shaking hands with Sam Decker. "Do you know Elphin Cantle?" said Sam. And the boy, coming sulkily forward, shook hands too. "I had an idea we'd meet someone we knew if we came back this way," Sam went on. "Elphin and I have been putting up wild ducks at Decoy Pool and Mere Pool, and we came back by Cramblemore instead of the Godney Road. We had our supper at Upper Godney. They gave us half a meal pike. They gave us a small pike, and Mr. Murray had caught him yesterday when he was over there, in that pond at Lower Crennel. It tastes good, didn't it, Elphin? Served with fried parsnips and parsley?" "That sounds pretty good." Mr. Evans peered through the darkness into the boy's face. The name Elphin made him think of Gwydion Gwydion and of Taliesin. "I'd have liked to ask you in," he remarked, "but Mrs. Evans may be in bed. What do you make this time, Mr. Deckard?" Sam looked at his watch and announced that it was after 9. "You brought back that St. Augustine I lent you in the spring so faithfully that you're always welcome to any books you want to take from the shop." Sam thanked him, and they became silent. The two men stood awkwardly side by side, while Elphin, moving to the edge of the fence, set up his owl cry again. "I'll walk back with you, if I may, as far as my house," said Mr. Evans. But for some reason, perhaps because the boy elephant was so occupied with the owls, they neither of them made any move to start forward. And that's Glastonbury for today. Cheers.